partly to replace men that have gone to the front, but we also see women entering new areas in retail and business, which are both better paid and perceived to offer women more freedom than domestic service, which has been a huge employer of women up till now. 1918 is also a time of better educational opportunities. In that year, the school leaving age is raised to 14. It had been 12, and there's free elementary education for everyone. It's also the year that the Representation of the People Act is introduced, which nearly triples the number of people that have a parliamentary vote. It gives the vote to some women who are over 30 who can meet a property qualification, and the census tells us, in fact, about 2/3 of women can vote, but that still leaves a third who are excluded until 1928 with the introduction of universal suffrage. And also, very importantly, in 1919, we've had the Sex Disqualification Removal Act, which opens the way for women to enter professions they've been previously barred from. Particularly noteworthy cases, the legal profession. So after this, women can become magistrates, lawyers and barristers. It becomes easier for women to get university degrees, but it also means women can enter all sorts of occupations, like racehorse trainer, that they had actually been barred from taking part in. And these changes around this time are perhaps symbolised by the election in 1921 of Margaret Winterington. She was an MP for Lincolnshire, and she becomes the second woman to take up her seat in the House of Commons, and she's the first woman who was British born, Nancy Astor being born in America. And these changes have really come about very much as a result of a long-term campaign to win women the vote. And these suffrage campaigners, as they're known, have always seen the vote as a route to broader improvement for conditions for women and children. So let's take a moment just to look a bit at the pre-war history of the suffrage campaign, so that we can see how that changes by 1921. So many of you will know that one of the key figures for the suffrage campaign was Millicent Fawcett. She had been involved in calls for the vote from the late 1860s. By 1897, she'd become the president of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, and this drew together hundreds of suffrage societies across the country in a peaceful campaign to petition Parliament and to lobby MPs to call for women's right to vote. And this had perhaps 100,000 members at its height, so it was a very broad campaign across all different levels of society. However, by 1903, there was a feeling in some quarters that not much had changed, and certainly there'd been no progress in Parliament. So this woman, Emmeline Pankhurst, set up the Breakaway Women's Social and Political Union, and it's this group that's known for the more militant tactics of shouting in meetings, throwing stones and breaking windows, and going to be sent to prison and being force-fed. And it's this group that, rather smaller, perhaps a few thousand women at its height, that are more known as the suffragettes and are perhaps more militant and take on board civil disobedience tactics. But the differences between these groups can be over-exaggerated because their aims were the same, they often worked together, it was just that their means were rather different. And I'm going to talk about women from both sides of the movement as I go forward. So I'm going to start with Eva Stuart Jones. You see her here on the left with her 5 children. She was the president of the Lewis Women's Suffrage Society, a peaceful suffrage organisation established rather late in 1908, and you can see on the right hand side where she lived in Southover Grange. She's a very beautiful Elizabethan house in the centre of the town. So she's from a well-off background, married to a barrister. So you can see that this grouping had the support of the church, local businessmen, doctors' wives and surveyors. So it's very much part of mainstream society. And we know that Eva is motivated by things like the temperance movement and the church movement in support of suffrage, who see the vote as a route to improving conditions for women and children. And we can see here she is in Brighton. She's this lady here in the big hat next to the vicar. And this is the Church League for Women's Suffrage. And again, they're calling for the vote. They're trying to get new legislation to protect women and children. At this time, even in well-to-do areas, there's pockets of deprivation where children are going to school without boots, without food, without money to pay for the school's day's education. And she's also involved in things like lobbying the incoming MP to try to get him to support women's suffrage, which he doesn't. So this is before the war. When the war comes, her husband Thorold enlists in the Royal Sussex Regiment. He'd been a barrister before the war, but he's sent to the Western Front, and he's killed in 1915, leaving her with 4 children and pregnant with a 5th, who's born after his death. So when we look for Eva's records in the 1921 census, we can see that she's actually not at her home in Southover Grange. Her widowed mother-in-law is there, and she's actually in Seaford, perhaps on a vacation. And this is the census return for her. And we can see at the form at the top we have her. She's now the head of the household, and below there her 5 children. And the form asks specifically for people over 15 to say whether they are single, married or widowed, and Eva has entered herself as a widow. And it also asks for children under 15 to say whether their parents are alive or dead. And you can see in this case that the census records that the children's father is dead in every case. And of course, this is one of the ways that the census helps record and pick up the results of the First World War. And you can see also in the household, there's a nurse to help with the children. And another interesting piece of information is the box at the bottom of the form, which records the living conditions. So it gives you the total number of people present. There's 7 people there, and they've got 9 rooms. So these are the number of rooms, such as bedrooms, living rooms and the kitchen, but excludes things like landings, sculleries and bathrooms. And this the census officials would use to create an estimate of whether there's overcrowding or not. So that's obviously not the case here. This is generous living conditions. And in fact, at this period, overcrowding was generally falling for better off households as family size was declining. However, for the poorest households, it was actually increasing, partly because of the economic conditions, and partly, for example, whether breadwinner had been killed, for example, during the war. People were forced into larger family groupings, or perhaps to take on lodgers. So this is a really interesting box to look at when you're looking at the census form. And someone who may well have influenced Eva to take part in the suffrage campaign was Flora de Gauthrion Merifield. she was from Brighton, and her parents had been amongst the earliest supporters of Millicent Fawcett when she began her campaign. And Flora herself revitalised the Brighton and Hove Franchise Society, becoming its secretary, and also engaging some other campaigners, some pioneering medical women such as Dr. Helen Boyle and Louisa Martindale, which I'll come to later. And here we can see Flora. She's in the middle, marked with a cross. Here we go. And this photo is taken in 1913, and what she's doing, she's leading a campaign, she's leading a group of suffrage supporters from Brighton and the south coast up to London, and this is part of a major event called the Suffrage Pilgrimage, which drew 50,000 women from all parts of the country to converge on a mass rally in Hyde Park to call again for the vote. And if we look at Flora in 1921, she's still involved in campaigning for women to be represented in local government and to have equal citizenship, because there's still some way to go before the vote is granted to all women. But she also becomes more involved in international affairs. So let's just look at the census. She's filled in on behalf of her elderly father, Frederick, and he's 90 at this age, and he's a retired barrister for the East and West Sussex County Council. Flora is there, and there's also 4 servants, including a nurse, presumably to look after her father. There's 2 visitors and a visitor's servant. And they're living in Clifton Terrace, which you can see at the bottom, and there's 13 rooms, so really very nice accommodation. And one thing that's interesting about this form to me is that in the far right column, where people have to put down their occupation, clearly you can see the servants are described as cook or parlourmaid, but both Flora and her friends have described themselves as not occupied for a living. And this is quite interesting because women at this period often are listed as home duties, and that's because the census form itself explicitly says that if women are housewives taking care of unpaid domestic duties, they should list themselves as home duties. But there's also another category described as not occupied for a living, and that's where people are living on their private means, their own or others, so their own income. So this gives us, again, it's another indication of Flora's quite comfortable standard of living, but also a hint that actually she's involved in lots of other different activities. So in 1920, for example, she's been to Geneva as part of an international conference to support the aims of the League of Nations, and she continues to be the secretary of the Brighton branch of the Friends of League of Nations. So I'm now going to move on to people who are a bit more radical in the name of winning women the vote, and these are Edith Zangwill and her husband Israel. They lived in East Preston in West Sussex, and you can see them in the centre of the photo on the left. They were writers and campaigners, both for women's suffrage and for a Jewish homeland. And Edith was later a campaigner for disarmament in the early 30s. And they worked with the Women's Social Political Union, lecturing and campaigning along the south coast, and with the Brighton organiser of the WSPU, Greta Allen. And in fact, earlier censuses record their political opinions, because in 1911, the WSPU and a similar organisation, the Women's Freedom League, called on its members to boycott the census because they felt if women weren't going to get the vote, that they shouldn't comply with the census. Maybe they shouldn't pay their taxes either. And so here's their census return for 1911. And you can see that most unusually, it starts not with the head of the household, but by listing the two servants, Lillian Hockery and Sarah Grindrod. And then in another hand, perhaps that of the census official, Edith's name has been added along with that of her daughter, Margaret. And in fact, Edith has written on the form, and what she said is that the rest of the household is not entered, as we feel that until women have the political right of citizens, they should not perform the duties of citizens. Mr. Zangwill is not at home. So we can clearly see here that the Zangwills are abiding by the WSPU aim of avoiding or evading or protesting the census in some way. And they continue to support the campaign for suffrage and are in fact early members of the Jewish League for Women's Suffrage, which is set up the following year. However, when we come to 1921, things look very different. So here's their census return for that year, and the hierarchy has re-established itself. At the head, we have Israel. He's an author. He was a well-known playwright at the time. Edith has also described herself as an author. She was a published novelist and produced 7 books during her lifetime. She also describes herself as taking care of home duties. Then we can see their 2 children, Margaret and Oliver, who's been born since the 1911 census, plus a governess and a servant and a visitor. Now, the people that had been involved in the suffrage campaign after the initial breakthrough in getting the vote become really leaders in terms of making practical changes in society and improving conditions for women and children. And we can see this in the next person I'm going to talk about, which is Mary Hare, and she may be familiar to some of you from who are interested in history locally. But I'm going to step back a bit from 1921 and I'm going to look at the conditions in which she grew up. So she was actually born in Islington. Her father ran a draftsman's business which went bankrupt, leaving the family in rather more difficult circumstances. But you can see at this age, Mary is highlighted in green here, and she's 15 and described as a scholar, so still in some form of education. And this is a time when the school leaving age is 12, so she's still perhaps rather unusually for a girl receiving further education. And then if we look at her 2 elder sisters, Margaret and Constance, they're both scholars. They're 17 and 18, and this is at a time when it's very rare for women to go to university. And the eldest sister, Ada, is a governess. So we can see in this household there's quite an emphasis on education and providing it to girls as well as boys. And so perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that this then becomes a real motivating factor in Mary's life. And by the time of the next census in 1891, she's actually become a principal for a school for the deaf in Croydon. And she's very concerned to provide a school educational setting for deaf children rather than a more institutional setting that's more current at the time. And she develops a system based on lip reading. And by the time of the 1911 census, she's moved her school to Hove. And also, interestingly, at this time, despite being a school principal, she's also a pretty ardent suffragette, and she takes part in the 1911 census boycott. And here's her return. She's written across it in black ink: "Women don't count, therefore they will not be counted." So the information that you do see on this form has actually been provided by the census official, who's written in blue ink. And he says that he's called at the school and he has spoken to the housekeeper who've said to him that Mary is the head. There's a number of teachers there, and then 16 boys and girls who are being educated. And also the 1911 census is interesting because of this column which collects information on infirmity, as they call it. And you can see that perhaps the official has entered that the children at the school are deaf from birth. Now, this represents a change in 1921 where there's no question about infirmity, and the reason for this was that expert advice was that the quality of the information collected via the census on this topic wasn't terribly reliable, and there were better ways of finding it out. However, you can find traces of information around this through things like a keyword search, or, for example, looking for institutions that reflect their role in their name, or if somebody has self-identified, for example, as deaf or injured during the war, and if someone, such as a matron of a convalescent home, has provided on the information on the census, but essentially it's unasked for, so it's up to you to kind of look and see if you can find it. And when we come to 1921, what's Mary doing then? Well, actually, she's really a trailblazer in a lot of areas. So she's opened her school. We know that she's a suffragette and a campaigner for women's rights. In 1915, she takes on yet another new role, and she sets up a women's volunteer police service in Brighton to protect what she sees as vulnerable women and girls, much against the wishes of the local constabulary. And we can see her group here. And 1915 is in fact the year that the first woman is allowed officially into the police force in the face of quite a bit of resistance. And there's lots of information about Mary on the website of the Old Police Station website in Brighton. And we can see her here in the 1921 census. She's now the principal of a larger school for deaf children in Dean Hollow in Burgess Hill, where she's living at the school along with a gardener, nurse and teacher. And although Mary died in 1945, the school moved to Berkshire and operates till this day, giving an improved level of education to children who'd previously been rather excluded from the mainstream system. Another suffrage campaigner turned trailblazer is Helena Normanton. She was born in London like Mary, and her father died when she was very young, and her mother moved her to the whole family to Brighton when Helena was 4, and ran a series of small businesses, including a boarding house to keep the family going. Helena went to what's now Varndine School in Brighton, and then trained as a teacher at Edgehill University. But then she changed direction and moved towards the legal profession, which she saw as treating women badly because they couldn't understand how the law was operating, and they didn't have access to good legal support. And in fact, she becomes the first woman to join the legal profession in 1919. In December of that year, just as the Sex Disqualification Removal Act passes. She's called to the bar in 1922, which means that she can represent people in court. And in 1949, she, along with Rose Heilbronn, is the first woman to be appointed King's Counsel, what we would now say is a QC, Queen's Counsel, so a senior level of the legal profession, conducting murder trials and so forth. And she's also very much a feminist and campaigns for divorce reform, so making a practical difference to the lives of other women. And if we look at her return for 1921, we can see some of these changes actually happening. So here she is, she's living in London. You can see on the left-hand side, she's put her name as Helena Normanton, Bachelor of Arts. So she's an early woman to receive a degree, and obviously proud of that fact. Under occupation, she's got 4. So she's put law student, and this will actually be one of the first times a woman will have been able to record this in the census, that that's what she's doing. She's also giving lectures. She has the inevitable home duties, and she's a writer. And she's living on her own without any domestic servants or help. So she's living independently in a flat in London. And in 2021, English Heritage put up a blue plaque to her at this residence, noting her advocacy for women's rights and her breakthrough into the legal profession. And then just this week, her presence in Brighton was commemorated with this new blue plaque at Clifton Place. And this came about as a result of a campaign by 2 local schoolgirls, Izzy and Sophia. Sorry, I've forgotten their surnames. Kilburns, there it's come back to me. And they were successful in getting this up to commemorate really what's an amazing achievement, and that's changed the law for many women. And another area where women started to make a particular practical difference is in healthcare. And one of those who's very relevant to the local scene is Louisa Martindale. She came from a politically active family. Both her mother and father were very involved in progressive causes, and she is a suffrage campaigner. As we say, she was involved with the Brighton and Hove Women's Franchise Society, but she also becomes the first woman GP in Brighton in 1911. She's part of the Scottish Women's Hospital movement that Marion mentioned earlier, and she provides assistance to soldiers during the First World War, much in the face of resistance from the senior levels of the British Army. In 1931, she becomes president of the Medical Women's Federation, and in 1937, she's the first women member of the Council for the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. And of course, that's quite an eye-opening moment when you think this is the first time a woman has actually been in a role like this at a college dealing with these issues. And she is teams up with, I'm just going to look at her in the 1921 census. She's recorded here in Adelaide Crescent in Hove, and she's puts her occupation down as physician, magistrate. She's got a degree. She's also a JP. She's a JP. So again, reflecting the passage of the 1919 Act. And she's an employer with a number of servants, because it's quite a large house. And also living there is Ismay Fitzgerald. And it said that, although opinions do differ a little bit, it does say people do think that Ismay is Louisa's partner. And we can also see what their the area where they live looks like today. So this is Adelaide Crescent. So you can see a very pleasant part of Brighton and Hove. And Louisa teams up with this woman, Dr. Helen Boyle, again an early woman medic, and Dr. Boyle sets up the Lewis Road dispensary, which starts first of all dealing with outpatients, and eventually takes inpatients and expands to this building in the Ditchling Road, which is becomes known as the Lady Chichester Hospital for Women and Children. And what's groundbreaking about this hospital is that it's aimed at providing mental health care for poorer women who aren't able to afford to go into convalescent homes. And when one looks at the supporters for this hospital, one can see that many of them have a background in the suffrage campaign, and its fundraising efforts are regularly described in the Common Cause newspaper, which is the newspaper of the NUWSS. Now, in 1921, this hospital expands to this larger building in Hove, and it's treating people with mental health conditions, but in a rather different way from the more mainstream institutions of the time. It has a much more homely atmosphere. There's an emphasis on occupational therapy and physical exercise. And it's caring for women who have been struck down by illness and by overwork and various mental health issues. And interestingly, its reports also talk about helping women who are suffering from the after effects of the war. So we often hear about the psychological impact of the war on men in terms of things like shell shock, but of course women also exposed to some of these. And its reports talk about things such as a nurse who's been coming back from overseas. She's been on a ship that was bombed and has sunk, and she spent 6 hours in the water and has been suffering from shock after this. So again, these hospital records draw out some rather different stories from some of the ones that we're most used to hearing. And if we look at who's working at this hospital, as well as male physicians, we can see that there's a large number of women working there. Helen Boyle herself, a number of other doctors, including Nora Crowe, house physicians, the matron, and also the dispenser, which I guess is the pharmacist, are all women staffing this building. And if we look at the 1921 census, we can see that the nurses are living there, and also on site is Dr. Crowe. Now, up until this point, Helen Boyle has been living at the hospitals where she's been working, but by 1921, sorry, I'll come back to that. She's in her 50s and she's living at a separate small house in Pycombe. And then I just wanted to mention, if we look at the range of occupations of the women patients, we can see that 9 of them have put down home duties. 3 of them are in domestic service, which is still a major employer at this time. So before the war, perhaps a third of women working outside the home working in domestic service. This has fallen to perhaps a quarter after the war, as women try to move into other professions which are better paid and offer more freedom, but it's still a significant employer. And then there's a range of other roles, including someone here who describes themselves as a former army volunteer. So this is someone who is attached to the volunteer aid detachment, so they might be a nurse or a driver, and this perhaps speaks to some of the things I was talking about before about women being treated for the after effects of the war. And also in this year, we have the opening of the Sussex Maternity Hospital in Buckingham Road, really important at this time. So infant mortality has been falling for a number of years, and in fact in 1921 it's the second lowest level on record up to that date, but that's still 24 times what it is today. So clearly an area where there was a huge need for improvements. And it's also the year of a royal visit to open nurses' home at the Royal Sussex County Hospital. So we've already heard some women that are in working both at home and outside, and I'm going to look at these in a little bit more detail now. So I'm going to start with Virginia and Leonard Wolff, well known writer and political activist who lived in this beautiful National Trust property, Monk's House, near Lewes. And on the 1921 census, we can see that Leonard has described himself as an author and editor. He's working for the Contemporary Review in Fleet Street, and he had been involved in developing ideas for the Fabian Society, which went into the development of the League of Nations. Virginia Woolf has had to put down her first name, Adeline Virginia Wolff, and describes herself as an author working at home. But it's actually the next two people that I want to talk about in a bit more detail, Nellie Boxel and Lottie Hope. And here they are in 1922. Nellie is on the left, Lottie is in the centre, another Nellie is on the right, and she was a governess for the child in the chair, Angelica, who was Virginia Woolf's niece. And Nellie and Lottie had met in a domestic service, and one of the things that I wanted to bring out is how the lives of domestic servants were very much dependent on their employer. Lottie had actually been brought up in a children's home, and her name was given to her by the children's home. So she has no original birth name and no relatives. She does receive an education, but at the age of 14 she leaves and goes to work and is in domestic service. She eventually ends up in the same household as Nellie, who has also entered domestic service aged 14, and they become firm friends. And when their current employer, who is the art critic Roger Fry, moves from the country to the London and no longer needs these servants, they move to work for the Wolffs, and they might be paid perhaps £28–30 a year, but they're entirely dependent for their board and lodging on their employers. And if they're no longer needed, as is the case as you go into the 1930s and 40s, where people neither can afford nor want to have servants, then they run the risk of losing their employment. And indeed, when Lottie retires, she moves into Nellie Boxel's family home. And we can see another example from the Crook household here in Hove. Solomon Crook is a tailor, and he's living with his wife and two children. And they have a domestic servant, Polly. This isn't a photo of her, it's a stock photo, but you can see that she's 14. So she's someone who has just left school and entered service. And she's also just operating in a general capacity. So again, this is something that happened with the so-called servant shortage. People tended to employ fewer servants and employ them in less specialised roles, so that they would have to carry out all the work, including the sort of dirtier work of lighting the fires and carrying out the chamber pots. So quite a difficult and tough life on occasions. And there was also an international aspect to domestic service. So there's this really useful website called A Vision of Britain, which provides a summary of what the 1921 census tells us for England and Wales. And one of the things that, perhaps quite surprisingly, it tells us is that East Sussex heads the table of having the largest number of people who were born in what was then the British Empires, and they've called the phrases colonial born. And what this does to reflect some degree of ethnic diversity, but the larger effect here is of Britons who have gone out to parts of the British Empire and then have come back to Britain, either with just temporarily for a visit, or to put their children in education here, or to come back permanently, perhaps to retire. We can see West Sussex is also has a large number of individuals like this, and towns like Eastbourne, Hastings, again feature highly in this list. And when families moved between different parts of the British Empire, they occasionally brought their servants with them. And one of the groups of people that we can identify in the census are ayahs. These are Indian nannies and nursemaids who would have been recruited in India to work for the family, and then have made the transoceanic crossing to come to Britain with their employers. And there were also Chinese and East Asian women who worked in this role, and they're known as amahs. And if we look at the census, we can see the Keelan family, headed by Douglas, who is a traffic manager for the Indian State Railways. He's with his wife Edith, 11-year-old daughter, and a child of 1. And the woman that's accompanied them as a child's nurse and described as an ayah is Janahai, who's 35, married and from Bombay. And we can also see another woman working in this role with a separate family, the Murdochs, both staying in Eastbourne at this time. She's had an anglicised first name. She's just described as Emily Ayah, and it is said that some of the ayahs were either from a Christian background or had converted to Christianity while working in these households. We also find traces of male servants as well at this time. So in normal times, the ayah would then go back with the family to India, but that wasn't always the case, particularly with more unscrupulous employers. And so there were a number of ayahs' homes open particularly in London, and this is an example of the one in Hackney, to accommodate ayahs and amahs and to try and find them a new employer who would pay for their passage back to their home country. And in 1921 we can see that there's 10 women living in the Hackney ayah home, and one might think that this is a kind of Victorian practice, but actually the home expands in 1921 and doesn't close until 1941. And there's a lot more information about this at Hackney Museum. Have a current exhibition about this, and they do have records of an abandoned ayah in Hastings, with people collecting money to send them to the Hackney home so that they can find new employment. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about the situation of widows and children in this period. And I'm going to talk about the Upton family, building on a previous Strike a Light project, Orange Lilies. And I'm going to talk about Frederick Upton, who was born in Brighton, one of 8 children, and his father was a rubbish collector for the local council, and unfortunately killed in an industrial accident, leaving this already poor family in difficult straits. And if we look at them in 1911, we can see that the household is headed by Rose Ellen Upton. But we can also see that all the women in this household are working for a laundry, either as a machinist or preparer. And along with the daughters, there is also a boarder and Frederick himself, and they're living in just 4 rooms. So clearly quite a degree of overcrowding in these conditions. Later, Frederick marries, and he has a child, and then enlists in the army and is killed during the First World War and buried here in Hamel Military Cemetery in France. So if we look at then what happens to this family as a consequence of the war. So his wife, Elizabeth, is left a widow with 2 children. However, Frederick is not the only casualty of the family. His sister, Naomi, loses her husband and moves back in with her mother, bringing her son with her. And this is an example of the kind of blended families that develop after the First World War, where widowed daughters move back in with their parents. And then his sister-in-law, Florence Upton, is also widowed. So we can see that 3 men have died, leaving behind 3 widows and in fact 6 children. And for Florence, we don't have here a census record. What we have is her pension record. And you can see at the bottom that she's being paid 20 shillings and 6pence a week. And that's quite significantly below the average male wage, which would have been around 26 shillings at this time. So probably quite a struggle to get by with 3 children on this amount of money. And the reason we don't see Rebecca in the 1921 census is that she actually meets a Canadian soldier who's recovering from his wounds at what was at the time the Kitchener Military Hospital, is now a part of Brighton General Hospital. And in 1918 she marries him, and we assume moves to Canada. And in fact, there was quite a lot of government support for widows and single movement women to move to Canada and other British dominions. And of course, it's not just death that causes hardship for family. Families are left caring for people with very serious illnesses. And this is an example from the 1921 census that was found by my colleague Lucy Daish. And this is the Wackley family actually in London. It's headed, perhaps rather unusually, by Eleanor. And she is living with 2 single brothers, Finsbury, who is a lawyer, and Bernard, who appears to be a student of medicines. And also living there is a nephew whose parents have both died previously. And we can see, although it's not asked, that under occupation, Eleanor has added that he's lost his leg and hip in the war, so quite seriously injured. And she's vented her frustration in the census record. And she said, "Risen my taxes. Instead of my being able to give to him," presumably the nephew, "and knight those who sit on velvet chairs. I am only a woman, don't count. The former rateable value for the house was quite enough for me to pay. I've spent half my own income on this boy since quite a lad. I appealed, what use?" So we can see that even more middle class and comfortably off families are feeling the effects of wartime inflation, the economic depression, and the impact of caring for relatives after the war. So these are just a few samples of the many people that are recorded in the census. But I think we can say that we can see that the impact of war is felt across the society, whether you're talking about wealthy families like the Stuart Jones or the Wackleys. We can see that it's not just only the great emotional impact of the war, there's the financial impact of death and injury. We can clearly see that women are working outside the home before, during and after the war. So whether that's the Upton family working in the local laundry, or women working at home as authors and writers, after the war entering things like the legal and medical professions, and of course nursing. But we see that many girls and women are still in service, and that the young girls are going into domestic service still from 14 onwards. And I think we can see that suffrage campaigners are moving from being protesters, actually breaking the law in a minor way by avoiding the census, to becoming professionals and in fact upholding the law either in the voluntary police force or as part of the legal profession, and that they're using their new position to bring about practical improvements for other women too. And I think this is particularly evident around the area of healthcare, which is getting some attention that perhaps it's not really had in the past. So I hope that you found that interesting. I would be really happy to answer any questions just before we have a break. So do please let me know what you think. Thank you. Oh, sorry, you're muted.
Thank you so much, Diana. That was absolutely gripping, really interesting, and a really wide-ranging sort of, exploration of different kinds of lives for women in the 1921 census. Really great to see so many different kinds of experiences. We haven't got any sort of direct questions, although someone's mentioned that a woman you mentioned earlier, Margaret Winterington, nee Longbottom, was trained as a kindergarten teacher by Amy Walmsley in Bedford. And I also wondered if Tom Winterington, who fought as a commander in the Spanish Civil War, might have been some relation. I don't know if that's a bit of a left field question, but
I do know that Margaret took over the seat that her husband had previously, and he had died. I don't know if that's the same person.
Same person.
Yeah, but she did. Yeah. She definitely also used her role in the House of Parliament to campaign on women's issues and to try and change the law in women's favour.
And for children, she lobbied for children, the care of children. She really benefited from her time in Bedford.
I'm sure everyone does. Thank you, that's fantastic. Helena has also, or Helena, sorry if I'm saying your name wrong, has also mentioned Val Brown's fantastic book, which is called Women's Hospitals of Brighton and Hove, which is all about Dr. Boyle and Dr. Martindale. I've got a copy actually, although I haven't looked at it for some time, but it's a really good book. If anyone wanted to sort of follow that up in future.
Yes, and I think it's a fascinating history, and the reports of the hospital are online via the Wellcome Trust, and the building. The hospital in Hove continued into use into the 1980s, and I think now it's still providing, as part of the NHS, a daycare centre to provide psychiatric support. So these are really long-term changes that feed out into what becomes the new normal in terms of the way that we consider hospitals should be operated or schools should be operated. But certainly, thank you for that mention of that book. I would be interested to read that.
And Lucy Dace has just mentioned that Louisa Martindale had a practice at 10 Marlborough Place in Brighton, opposite the Pavilion. Although there's sadly no plaque or anything on the building. Although she hopes to make it a project at some point.
Indeed, I had a quick look to see if there was any commemoration of Louisa Martindale, and I didn't find that, and I find that quite surprising, given that she, made such an impact in terms of healthcare, and I think that would be a very worthwhile a project, and something I personally would love to see.
So I'm just aware of time. What I might do is do a quick screen share for you to have a look at whilst we're on a 10-minute break, which is just something that came up from another project about Ethel Close, who is a suffragette living in Hove in the sort of late turn of the century, and so that might be of interest. But what I will get you to do now then, thank you so much for that, Diana, is if we come back at 11:40, So at 11:40, if everyone turns their cameras off and sound off, so we can have a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back at 11:40 to move on to the next stage of Diana's research and research tips, which I'm sure you'll all find really fascinating. There's so much in here to discuss, and then we'll take further questions at the very end of our webinar, which will be sort of just after 1 o'clock now. So I hope you can stay on for that. And it's been really good to talk to you all. Apologies again for the technical issues at the beginning, and we will make sure that doesn't happen again. So yes, I'll just do a screen share now, and if you all come back at 11:40, we'd really appreciate it. Thanks so much. It's here.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
You can read that.
Relax then, Robinson. Now it's 10 minutes. You look, to be honest, I should take a photo of that. You're surrounded by flowers, you're under the sunscreen, you're wearing your shorts and your t-shirt, you're reading a book. It's finally happened, hasn't it?
I just haven't got anything else particular to do. I'll just sit here in the sun reading. So it appears to be working fine. The slippers on, very relaxed. So it's moving around.
Just mute. Hello there. Hi.
Hi, Diana. Hello, everyone. We're going to start again in about 30 seconds. So if you are welcome to come back now, pop your videos on so we can see you, and we can start the second part of Dr. Diana Wilkins' session, webinar. And as I mentioned, we'll have further questions at the end of this time. How long do you think the second part will be, Diana?
My bit is 15 minutes, but happy to answer questions at the end, either about the women's history part or about using the census, or anything else that comes up that's relevant.
Fantastic, thank you. So yes, do get your questions in the chat between now and sort of 1 o'clock, and we can take those questions around about then. But if we want to start up again.
Okay. So as Nicola mentioned at the beginning, there is currently a charge for accessing the records of the 1921 census. So we thought it'd be useful to talk a little bit about how to get the most use out of the census, and also do that in a way that's quite efficient and keeps costs down where it's possible. And all the information that I've talked about today has come from the family history website, Find My Past, which is currently the main host of the 1921 census records. Of course, there are many other family history websites, for example, like Ancestry, MyHeritage, Find a Grave, Genie.com, and sometimes it can be quite useful to use different websites and compare and contrast the results that you get out of them. Now, all of these tend to have a subscription, which can vary between £10 and £20 a month, based on your level of subscription and what records you have access to. But I'll be talking about ways to get free access to that. And once you are in, for example, through a public library, a lot of the material is free. And when it comes to the 1921 census, this comes in two forms. So you might recognise this kind of digitised summary of the census, known as a transcription, which has the benefit of being nice and clear, but you can also access the original record, and I would always recommend going for this if you have to make a choice. So for 1921, the transcription costs £2.50 a go. The actual record costs £3.50, but it's absolutely worth it because it tends to be more accurate. It provides more information, for example, where people have written other comments on the census. And of course, it's in the hand of the person that filled out the census, and you get to see their signature and what they've said. So I'd always recommend, as I say, the original version of the census. When thinking about how to get the most out of the census, the best analogy I can think of is really a kind of a jigsaw puzzle of bringing pieces together from all different sources and trying to build up a more complex picture. So I tend to try and start by understanding the broader context of what's going on at the time, because this gives me a sense of what kinds of records I could be looking for. Is military service relevant? Have people volunteered during the war? Would pension records be available? And what can I find out from family and friends or from online? And then using I'm going to call quote unquote free resources, try and build up a picture of much detail as possible about the person. So you saw on several occasions, I went back to the 1881 census or the 1911 census, that you can access without cost for an individual, so that when it comes to looking for the 1921 census result, I'm able to pick the exact census return that I want. I think lesson that I have learned, sometimes to my cost, is always really important to look at the original sources for things. So when one reads a blog article, a newspaper report, it's always worth going back to the original record, that reference that's based on, the original newspaper report, the original census record, because things just get missed over time, or errors get introduced, or you lose the original context. And I think with searching the census, again, less is more to begin with. The National Archives have recently done a very helpful webinar about using the census, and they really said put in a minimal amount of information into the system at the beginning, and use your own judgment and your own extra knowledge to pull out the records that you think are most relevant. I think an exception to that might be if you were looking for someone with a very common name, you might need to put in more information at the beginning. Otherwise, you will get hundreds of returns, and that'll be extremely time consuming. And then, as I say, check the sources against one another and save everything, which is easy to do within the family history websites, because you always want to come back and check whether you've got the right person or the right date. And so what does the search look like? Well, here's a picture from the Find My Past website, and the simplest type of research that you can do is just by person. So you put the first and last names in, and again, you might want to keep the last name, refine your search just to that specific last name, but allow variants of the first name to come up. I mean, you've already seen today people are known by their middle names, for example, or there's different spellings of their names. So you might want to leave that quite wide to begin with. And again, in terms of date of birth, I would never search just on a single date of birth. The way that census compiled makes that quite unlikely to work very well, and also people are not always correct about their own date of birth for various reasons. Then we're now looking at the advanced search page, which allows you to put in lots of, for example, keywords. So you could search for the keyword deaf, for example, and that will return a number of records. You can also search by location, so you could investigate your own street, or you could look up an institution like a school or a hospital. And there's a whole set of codes to go with different types of institutions, which allows you to search those more easily. And the same is true for occupations. There's instructions on the census form about how people were supposed to enter their occupations, and then these are all coded up. So you could, for example, look for how many cobblers or tailors there are in a particular area. And there's lots of information about how to do this on the National Archives website. And I'm going to give a quick example here of the de Meza family. So Captain Jacob de Meza lived briefly in Brighton, but was killed during the First World War, leaving behind his wife Adelaide and a young daughter. And I've been able to find Adelaide's records using just 2 or 3 simple pieces of information. So I had her name, obviously, and in fact, importantly for women, I had her maiden name. I had an idea of her date of birth and also where she was born, although I didn't use this last factor in the search because things like counties and registration districts do change over time. And so this is an example of where I've used that afterwards to make sure I've got the right person. And I've started earlier. I haven't started in 1921. I've gone back to her childhood to try and find out more about her and other members of the family. So here she is in green at the bottom when she's 18 and living with her family in London. And you might be able to spot straight away that there's an error in the transcription for her father. His name has been spelt differently. the system has picked up the rest of the family already, but obviously it'd be an issue if I was searching for him. So I then, with this information, turned to the 1921 census, and because Demesa is quite an unusual name, it only returned 2.
Sound's gone, Diana. Can you? Your sound's gone, Diana. Can anyone else hear anything? Can anyone else? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Nicola, but I can't hear Diana.
Yeah, Diana. Right, what can we do? Diana, do you want to try turn your microphone? You might have hit your microphone button by mistake, perhaps.
There we go.
Fantastic. Welcome.
I don't know what
One of those days.
I don't know what IT devil we've offended, but they're right all over us. Okay, great. Well, so we can see that there's been again a transcription error in the name, but because Demesa is quite unusual, as I say, there was only 2 returns. But if I hover over this name, I can see that it's the right person because I can recognise Felix and Priscilla, her parents. So that means that actually it's highly likely this is the right person. So I could go ahead and purchase this record. The searchers also interestingly turned up and her again in 1923 because this is when she remarries, in fact. So that's a piece of information I wasn't expecting. And one of the ways of getting around some of the issues that we've seen here is that you can use a wildcard search, and by that I mean you can add an asterisk in parts of the name so that you pick up Adelaide, Ada, Alice, anything beginning with A, and you can again do that for the surname, and then you would pick up Demesa as one word as well as Demesa. And that's a good way of, if you get no results returned from the system of or your ancestor doesn't suddenly stops appearing in the census, that's a good way to search for them again in case there's been some kind of transcription error or a change in the way that the name's been used. And here she is in the 1921 census. She's a widow, and with her young daughter, like Naomi Upton, she's moved back in with her family. You can see she's there. And actually, in reasonable circumstances, they have a 10-room house. So I've described the phrase free resources, and what I mean by that is actually that if you have a library card, depending on your county's provision, you can access quite a lot of this information for free. So from home you can access the Times newspaper digital archive, the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, and if you go into the library in person you will be able to use family history websites for free with your library card. The 1921 census still has a charge associated with it. And when one does access a family history website, there's lots of material you can look there for free. So all the previous censuses, the electoral registers. So again, this is a good way of looking at 1921 and you'll be able to pick up adults in the electoral register, even if you don't want to buy the census certificate. It's also a good way of cross-checking the two. The London Gazette, which is a newspaper of record, which records things like changes of names and military honours. That's quite useful. And then there's all sorts of other types of material and military records overseas, newspapers, and then they tend to, your access to them tends to vary with the type of subscription that you've got. Then, as I've mentioned, if you do buy a census record, I would always choose the actual census record over the transcription. And then moving on to the National Archives itself. So if you search online, it has this really useful set of research guides, which are here on the right. And they give an overview of the topic, and they also tell you what records exist, so that you know where to look. And that's particularly important because it also tells you what records don't exist. So, for example, the 1931 and the 1941 census don't exist, and many of the widows' war pensions records have also been destroyed. So it kind of sets expectations of what kind of information you can get out of it. And also, if you visit the National Archives and Kew in person, you can find a number of legal records around divorce, crime, and particularly important if you think that the person that you're interested in has roots abroad, you can find the naturalisation certificate when they became a British citizen, which gives you tends to give you more detail about the exact location that they came from in the previous country, what their names might have been at that time. And then your local county record officer, for example, the Keep at Falmer or the Chichester Record Office in West Sussex, have a lot of material. Just recently, they put all the parish registers online. So if you're going back a bit and you want birth, baptisms, marriage, burial certificates, you should be able to search those now. And you can look and see what they do have in the collection. And if you visit in person, they have hard copies of electoral registers and street directories, like an old style yellow pages that give both people's addresses and a lot of business information and a lot of maps. And so I think bringing all these sources together can provide a really rich picture of an individual's and the circumstances that they were living in. And then there's a number of specialist resources that I've drawn on today. So the first one of these is Mapping Suffrage, which records and gives biographical details for suffrage activists in 1911 and looks at whether or not they complied or evaded the 1911 census. And they're always looking for contributions from around the country. And you can see it's populated here for the parts of the southeast by the particular affiliation of the individual. And then Jill Liddington did a pioneering piece of work called Vanishing for the Vote, looking at census protesters. And Elizabeth Crawford has produced a number of reference guides, which are a good place to look to see if someone was involved in the suffrage campaign. And the National Archives have a searchable roll of honour of all the women who went to prison for the suffrage cause. Looking more broadly, the British Red Cross has a useful free website where you can search for people who were nurses or volunteers during the First World War. Both men and women appear in here. And as I've also mentioned, the National Archive has a lot of information actually about how to use the census itself, and some webinars and links which are well worth looking at, as well as details on military records and pensions, and as I said, whole lists of the institutions and employment codes which you can access. And of course, there's been lots of brilliant work done by local authors and local groups to highlight women's history locally, both in Hastings and St Leonard's, the middle of Sussex, Brighton and Hove, and Lewes. And more broadly, there's a very useful book by Andrea Hetherington, who examines in some detail the circumstances of British widows from the First World War and how they managed after the loss of loved ones. And as Nicola mentioned, we have some drop-in sessions if you'd like to come and use the 1921 census for research purposes or to explore your own family history. And again, on the 15th of July, I'll be talking about how we can use the census to look at aspects of life more generally in Sussex that year. So thank you very much. I hope that you found that useful, and I'm very happy to answer any questions either on women's history or using the census. If Lucy is still with us, she's been involved in digitising the census, so she might also have some top tips for people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana. That was fantastic, and it's amazing how much you can cover in sort of a short kind of 2-hour period. Actually, there's so much in there, and hopefully a lot of sort of jumping off points for people. Lucy's unfortunately had to go. I think she had an academic commitment, but we've had a couple of questions in. One from Helena. I hope I'm saying your name right. Who is currently writing a book format biography of the suffragette Mary Richardson. And she's saying, whilst trying to find her in the 1921 census because she's got such a common name, it's obviously proving very costly. She's married her down to living in Chelsea, but she's not there in 1921. She's saying, by charging per hit instead of a flat rate per day, Find My Past favours people with unusual names.
Indeed.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the wildcard function might be your friend with that, but do you have any suggestions there, Diana, on that front?
Yeah, so that that's a real difficulty. What I would tend to do is try and research around her and find out as much detail as I could about where she might be living, and I would perhaps put that in the keyword function, so that you are then just narrowing down all the Richardsons with Chelsea or whatever in there, and kind of investigating them that way. And you may have already done that. The other thing this might not be the case, might be I've had a few people go abroad during the census, so it might be just double worth checking shipping records if that's a possibility. And then I think maybe whether you've looked at her in some of these standard reference books like Elizabeth Crawford's or Vanishing for the Vote, to see whether you can get additional information about her. My only other suggestion would be to go up to Q, where you can use the 1921 census for free. Also, as I understand it, medium term, it may become available for free in record offices. I don't know when that's going to be, and more generally in perhaps a year or so's time.
Thank you. I was just sort of typing on the chat that it's believed that Find My Past went quite significantly over budget with their digitisation. They were awarded the contract to digitise the census by National Archives, and so what they have to do is they have to recoup their costs before they can then make it free. So, for example, the 1911 census is free. It wasn't initially. And so it is hoped that this will be free in the next sort of year or 2 years. But we had a curator from West Sussex Record Office at our last webinar who thought that they would be getting free institutional access later this year. So do keep an eye out, because it's hoped that it will be expanded. But you can go to the National Archives in person and use the so we have another question from Bonnie, who is saying she's doing a PhD on housing schemes for single women in interwar London. She's been researching addresses initially, but most of these websites are around people. Any tips for those sort of housing schemes? Are you looking at somewhere like sort of Holly Lodge, for example, Bonnie? Is that something that you... specific housing for women?
Yeah, that's one of the schemes, that I research actually, but I have found, I just wondered if you had any tips really about going via addresses, because I just find that it takes me absolutely forever to locate a scheme. There was one called Addison House, for example, and it's on a road in London, and then all the flats were listed. Eventually I found them, but they were listed as road numbers, or I don't know if you have any experience of the differences when you're sort of going, when you only have an address, and particularly when it's flats.
My suggestion might be to look on the National Archives site where there is some information about, I don't know whether these might count as institutions. So some of these institutions are coded, and there might be some more information there about doing that. I imagine that you've also seen when you get a census record, you do get a kind of map with it as well, which shows you the area and the census registration district. I don't know if you've looked at any of those.
I don't think I have. No, a map. Gosh, I don't remember there being a map with it.
So when you get the census record up itself, there's a whole string of other images down the bottom, and if you click on there, it says additional information. And I know initially I was worried in case that charged me for something else again, but actually that gives you a map of the registration district, and that might be quite useful. Certainly, I imagine it will tell you what roads there are there.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think I've spotted that because, you know, I sort of was literally almost trying to do a journey with the enumerator and going all the way around that block, and then it would come to the number where the block of flats is, and it wouldn't be there. And I thought, oh gosh, where's number 24 with the block of flats on it? It just wasn't there.
It's just a thought, Bonnie, but it might have been bombed in the Second World War. I mean, potentially it was there, but isn't because of bombing. Not with this one. It wasn't the case. It's definitely there. What I've done is I've posted a link. There's a section on the Find My Past website which explores institutions. So it looks at workhouses, it looks at orphanages, it looks at centres, sort of mental asylums. But there's a small section on women's history. I've posted a couple from Sussex, but there's a much more wider London section. So that might be worth having a little look.
The other thing I would say is that the National Archives team are pretty helpful. So I'd say it's worth sending them an email and asking them for their advice, because they might be a bit busy at the moment, but I found them in the past to be very helpful and to get back with good advice about how to approach certain research questions.
Right, okay. And do you have unlimited time when you're at the National Archives then to look on the 1921?
I think you have to book it, but I think it's unlimited in terms of the number of records that you can look at.
Right, okay, thank you.
And there's also a book called Singled Out by Virginia Nicholson, which
that's great.
Yeah.
A lot of that might be worth it.
Yeah.
So, and also just a thought, but the Addison buildings were probably named after the Addison Act in 1919, which was the act which created the first sort of series of council housing. So it might be worth looking more into the Act in general, as that might give you some more pointers as to some of the buildings created.
Yeah, it's just more the case that I know the buildings, I know all my buildings, and I know, but it is just now what it is I'm now trying to flesh that out with who was actually living there in 1921. It's more that angle. So I've got all the kind of architectural and housing history and everything all in place, but now I'm just getting to the point where I actually want some nice examples of people. So I'm going a completely different way around to how people would normally be using that on these,
The other way, of course, would be maybe to look in the electoral register and look at the address, and then that will tell you who was living there. So you can, if you're near the record office with the printed electoral registers, you can do that, but you can also search some of the online electoral registers.
Yeah.
Simon has posted a couple of useful links, one called rootpoint.com, which he says is a very easy to use search engine for some census records, and is worth a look. And also the Ogle by Muster, I'm not sure if I'm saying it right, as a source for military records again. It's keen to bring a huge number of different sources. And John Purdy has said The 1921 image payment also includes a list of the route that the enumerator took to collect his census details. This is interesting. This might list the block of flats by name. So that might be worth a look on it.
I'm sorry, who did you say had posted that in the chat?
This is the last post in the chat by John Purdy, the 1920s.
Oh, okay.
So
thank you.
This is all part of this package of stuff that you get with the census image, so that's worth investigating.
Yeah, I've obviously not looked thoroughly at those bottom bits.
It's easy to miss that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Helena said she's mentioned the Mapping Women's Suffrage project, which I know that you know a lot about, Diana. She spent 5 years studying Hastings suffragettes and has compiled lots of information on them, which she has, but none of this information, so she'd like to get it recorded somewhere. I don't know, actually. Would you say, Diana? You probably know more about it.
Yeah, so this is run by Tara Morton, who is a PhD candidate at Warwick University, and it's had some funds from Warwick to get the website up and running, but at the moment it's a kind of voluntary activity on her part, but she is very keen to hear from researchers with additional information that could go into the website. So I think if you go to the website and press on the contact button and just drop her a line, she will, I'm sure, be very happy to hear from you. And generally she's looking for a short biography about 350 words long that summarises the campaigners' activities around that time, and they could belong to any of the sort of suffrage groups that were active at that time. And it's actually it's a nice resource as well to look at, because people have filled it in more detail, and have also done things like mention the other campaigners that somebody was connected with, and that's quite a helpful way of moving from one campaigner to the next one and seeing what the wider network was like as well.
Thank you. So should we take one more question?
Deborah has her hand up.
Deborah?
Oh, hi. Thanks ever so much, Diane. What a fascinating and brilliant talk, and like someone else has said, really, really wide-ranging and detailed. I have a couple of questions that are slightly escaped the census. There were a couple of things that you mentioned and I wanted to follow up on. And the first thing was about the illnesses that women had been impacted by the war, and where possibly I could find out more information about, but also about the nannies that were employed. You mentioned in Hackney, but you also mentioned one in Hastings. So there were just a couple of bits of information I wanted to follow up on that came out of your talk. Thanks.
Yeah, so and I'm very happy to share this. There is a report for the Lady Chichester Hospital that details the cases that they deal with, and describes 2 stories of women who have suffering from the psychological after effects of the First World War, and I think those weren't the only 2 by any means. So I'm happy to maybe share that afterwards. And in Hackney have done a really great job actually investigating this issue. So they have produced a map, a bit like the mapping suffrage tool, looking at where these nursemaids were living all over the country. So unlike, for example, sailors who came from India and the Far East, they would be in ports, and there'd be sailors' homes, and they would have each other for support. The ayahs were just with their employers, and they might be anywhere in the country, so they were potentially quite isolated. Generally, they went backwards and forwards with their employer, but there were several, as I said, homes for these for the so-called abandoned ayahs in London. And again, Hackney Museum has an exhibition on at the moment till the end of August about these homes. And I have found records of Ayers in the 1911 census, the 1921 census for Sussex, and there's also the case of the I think it was as late as the, I'm just trying, I can't quite remember, but it was quite a late case of this Ayah Mary, who is found in sort of semi-destitute circumstances in Hastings, and people collect together money to send her to the Ayah's home. One issue that is I hadn't been aware of, but actually there's a kind of limited sailing season from Britain to India at the time, and so that closes in March. And so you don't necessarily see the Ayers in the census, which takes place normally in April. So where they appear is quite often in shipping records. Another complication is that sometimes the names have been anglicised, and so it's difficult to tell, what their actual background is. But there's quite a bit of academic work building up in this country, and also in Australia, where many Ayers and Ammers came with British families, for example, at the evacuation of Singapore during the Second World War. And there was a conference on this last night, so perhaps afterwards I'd be happy to send you the link for that.
Oh, thanks ever so much. It's absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we're going to sort of lots more questions coming in now. Just one quickly. Online talk by the National Archive team earlier this year, which included a section about the Ayers. Yes, Teresa, that's true. But also Hackney Museum, as Diana mentioned, have got an exhibition about it at the moment, and they did a talk recently, last week, I think, which I think they're going to. They did record. Did you watch it, Diana?
I watched one last night, which was with the Greenwich Museums, which involved Hackney Museums and a number of different researchers. So perhaps I can get all these links together afterwards, and perhaps they could be sent round with the link for this talk afterwards.
Yes, that sounds great. So as I said, we will be uploading the recording of this along with some links and resources probably in about a week or so. But thank you everyone for attending. It's been really, really fascinating. Diana's done so much research and it's just great to read all about it. We've had a couple of quick comments. An episode of The Suspicions of Mr. Witcher, episode 3, deals with a family and Indian nanny beyond the pale. So if anyone wants to watch that, that would be of interest. But there is sort of new information. There's a website called Ayers and Ammers, which has been sent round as well, which might be of interest. Thank you, Dr. Diana Wilkins. You've been absolute star. It's been really interesting, and your knowledge has been great. Apologies again for the issues with the technological side of things. It's obviously not my day, but I hope that you still got the full benefit of the activities. We've got our next session on the 15th of July. We've got our disability panel event, which is also free, on the 1st of July, and hopefully you can follow Strike a Light and find out more about all of our activities into the future. Thank you very much everyone for coming today, and we'll be in touch in a week or so with updated information. Thank you.
Thank you.